Hello everyone, my name is Kamila Shamsie. I live in Karachi and I'm a literary journalist and critic and the area editor for the online literary encyclopedia and also author of a literary history, Hybrid Tapestries, the development of Pakistani literature in English. I'm also an advisor to the Lahore Literary Festival, which began 9 years ago, and this year it is being presented in a digital format. I have great pleasure in welcoming you all to this very special session at the Lahore Literary Festival with the award-winning Yann Martel and Fasih Ahmed. Yann Martel, as you doubtless know, received the Booker Prize for his amazing novel, The Life of Pi, which was then made into an award-winning, Oscar-winning film, actually. And his fiction has been translated into many languages and received much acclaim and more prizes, including his best-selling novel, High Mountains of Portugal, which came out in 2016 and is very, very highly praised everywhere. This is the first time Yann is participating in the Lahore Literary Festival, and well, I won't say any more. I will hand over to the moderator, Fasih Ahmed, and I look forward to their interaction.
Thank you, Ms. Shamsie. Yann, welcome to the Lahore Literary Festival. We're thrilled that you could join us from Saskatoon.
It's a pleasure. I wish I could be there in person, but we'll do that in a couple of years.
Inshallah, as they say. So, Yann, you were born in Spain. Your parents are Canadian. You live in Saskatoon, Canada. You've lived in Costa Rica, Mexico, because your father was in the Foreign Service. What is your sense of home, and how important is the sense of home to a writer?
Well, my sense of home is, I suppose, not conventional. I think most people usually define home in physical terms, most often a place, a geographic place, a city, let's say. Precisely because my parents worked for the Foreign Service and we moved around a lot, I never had a strong sense of home in terms of place. In fact, I've never had a strong sense of place. I've seen that in my fiction too. That's why it trots around the globe, because I have no particular attachment or detachment with any particular place. So I would say home was people, my parents, for example. And home ultimately was a certain sensibility. So if I look back at my childhood, the things that grounded me were aesthetic, emotional, intellectual experiences. So books that I read, paintings that I saw, museums I was dragged to as a child. Those are the kinds of things that gave me a sense of identity. So I think ultimately for me, home is people. It's the people I love, the people I know, and how I got to know them, which has often been through the arts. So as it happens now, I live in a place called Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, which is the proverbial middle of nowhere. It's in the Canadian prairies. Yesterday it hit minus 40 degrees Celsius. It's an extraordinarily cold place, a dry cold though, so if you're dressed for it, it's fine. And it's the sunniest part of Canada, by the way, where it's always bathed in sunshine. And I'm addicted to the sunshine. It's beautiful. But it is the middle of nowhere. And I just sort of landed here. I was a writer in residence for 1 year, and I just liked it. It's a small town. It's only about 300,000 people. So it's big enough that there are things to do, but not so big that you get lost in it and you don't know your neighbors and all that. So it was just the right size, I found. And I just happened to like it, so I've stayed here. And all 4 of my children were born here. So right now, home is Saskatoon, I guess. But frankly, if Saskatoon were taken away, it wouldn't be the end of the world. So it's a very mutable thing, my sense of home. But I'd say, most often on a daily basis, home is the book I'm writing.
Okay. And your father, Emile, translated The Life of Pi into French. Life of Pi, of course, the groundbreaking novel that came out in 2001. It won the Man Booker Prize the following year. Ang Lee won the Best Director Oscar for that, and the picture won 3 others. What was it like having your work translated by your father, who's also a writer and a poet?
In fact, it was both my parents, my mother and my father, who translated Life of Pi. Well, translation, as I'm sure you would know, is a fascinating thing because it's obviously not a mechanical thing. It's not a question of mechanically translating the in English to le in French. There's a real art to it. Each language, as you would know, has its own rhythm, its own song, its own dance, in addition to its own grammar and syntax. And to translate from one to another, it was fascinating in French because I speak French myself. In fact, French is my mother tongue. So whereas other translations, I had no idea. I just had to trust my translators. So, for example, Chinese, Latvian, those I don't speak a single word. Hungarian, so I just had to trust they did a good job. The only translation I participated in intimately was the French one. So my parents did a translation, and then I read it, and it was fascinating. For example, with French. And I wouldn't know about the languages of Pakistan, Urdu or whatever, but in French you have two styles of you. There's a formal you, vous in French, and there's an informal you, tu. And that depends on age difference, level of respect, etc. So a younger person speaking to an older person would say vous in French, not tu. Tu would be for friends. Right away in Life of Pi, for example, we had to decide whether when Pi is being interrogated by the Japanese investigators, whether he referred to them as vous or tu, and whether they, being foreign and older, referred to him as tu or vous. We had to decide the level of intimacy. That's just one level, but then there's just the whole, English lends itself very well to long sentences with lots of subordinate clauses, lots of conjunctions. I would say English on French, unless you're Marcel Proust, not quite as much necessarily. Anyway, you'd all figure out how does it resonate in this other language. So it was fascinating with my parents sitting down and discussing that of how would this, what would be the effect. It could have taken months, but of course, literary translators are a poorly paid species. They've got to crank them out quickly or quick enough. And so we had to slightly rush through. We couldn't spend as much time as we might have, but I loved it. In fact, it was interesting. Now, obviously at the very end of it, it's always better reading in the original language. It was weird reading Life of Pi and High Mountains of Portugal and the other ones in French because I could speak the language, but there was just a slight dissonance because it was, in a sense, the wrong language. But of course, if you don't speak the original language, you never notice that. So I love the Russians, but I don't speak a word of Russian. So all my Russians, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Turgenev, Gogol, I've all read them in English. And, to my mind, Tolstoy wrote in English, but of course he didn't. And to imagine what was lost, I can't really imagine that. But of course, things are gained, of course, too. Things are gained. But I still wonder what I've lost by not being able to read them in the original. Or another writer that I love is Yukio Mishima, the Japanese writer. Of course, I don't speak a word of Japanese. So you wonder what is lost, but there's also something gained, too. Of course, access to the story, access to these foreign territories that you wouldn't be able to access otherwise. But it's a fascinating process, translation. I rarely do it because I grind to a halt. I agonize over every little word and sort of, it's like rewriting something anew.
Did you get any criticism from your parents? Any pointers on what could be improved in the translation?
Well, it is interesting. Because translators have to translate every single word, they end up finding mistakes or certainly ambiguities. So, for example, I remember in my first book, The Facts Behind the Helsinki Rockamodios, when it was translated into German, my German translators pointed out that, I can't remember what are the stories, but I guess there was a description of a house. And they pointed out to me that I didn't know the meaning in English of the word gable, Gable. It says the way you write it doesn't make sense. You obviously don't know what a gable is. And I realized, I guess I don't. So that was one clear mistake. And in Life of Pi, I remember my parents pointed out, at one point there's a scene where the lifeboat is here, and there's an enormous shark. And I guess there was a pronoun, but it wasn't clear what the antecedent was, because their impression was that the lifeboat moved over the shark, and the shark was not moving. But in fact, it's the lifeboat that wasn't moving and the shark that slowly undulated underneath it. But the antecedent to it wasn't clear. And I didn't realize that it was ambiguous. To me, it was obvious what I meant, but it wasn't clear on the page because they initially mistranslated it. So I said, no, it's the shark that's moving and the lifeboat that is still. So yeah, they catch out little mistakes like that. It's kind of interesting. It's a rigorous process, so it does bring you up face to face with your text and any potential mistakes or ambiguities.
See, French is your mother language, as you said, but you're also fluent in Spanish, and of course you write in English. Have you been asked to, or have you considered writing in French or Spanish? Why English? How did you choose English as the primary language of your voice?
Well, I never would have written in Spanish. My Spanish is mostly oral. I occasionally write the odd thing in French, but I'm self-conscious when I write in French. I'm sort of aware that I'm writing in French. Whereas when I write in English, I'm not writing in English, I'm just writing. And of course, you play with the language when you write. You think up of vocabulary and you play with syntax. So you are playing with the language, but in a way that's completely unself-conscious. So no, I'm happy writing in English. As to how I came to write in English, well, I'm sure that's a very common experience in Pakistan. It just happens to be the language of my education. Because we were living in foreign countries, the first one I went to school in was in Alaska, and then in British Columbia, and then in Costa Rica. And in all three of those cases, at the time, there were no French schools. So there was no choice. I had to go to school in a foreign language, and the ambient language was English. And once I started doing that, I just kept on going in English. So I just did my education in English. So it's the language I learned how to think with the most precision. And it's the one in which I've read the most in English. So it's just the one I fell into. But it wasn't necessarily a choice. I think you're handed a language when you're young, and there's one that you master, and you maybe master others. I mean, maybe some people can write in multiple languages. I don't know if too many. I mean, you have immigrants like Beckett, who obviously grew up in English and wrote in French. But those are rare, and it's a very willful act to want to get on the outside of your native language. I'm not really sure I see the point, in the sense it strikes me that any language can do what it needs to do. They always talk about, Inuit languages have 26 words for snow. Well, any language, will have 26 words for snow if it needs to. If you have a Pakistani writer who wants to write about the high Arctic, he or she will find the right words in Urdu or whatever to describe 26 forms of snow. So it's a very flexible thing, a language. You just need to want to bend it around. So I happen to write in English, which I love. One of the things I love about English is its endless vocabulary. It's a language which has such an infinite number of words, far surpassing any other language. I really like that. Mind you, one thing I don't like in English, for example, is the letter R.
Okay.
The R sound, rural, is not very nice in English, rural. Whereas in French, rural, it's a really guttural R in French. So unless you're Scottish and you roll your R's like this, we've lost the R in English. So, every language has its strengths and weaknesses, but it all evens out eventually. So I happen to write in English. I'm quite happy with that. But I think every language can do what it needs to do.
You're married to a British novelist, Alice Keppers. Do you guys look at each other's work? What's it like being married to a novelist?
Well, she writes for young adults and for children, so we work in different genres. But she's very, very adept. She's a very good editor, whereas I'm not a particularly good editor, to be honest. I tend to sort of just, well, that's good enough, it seems to me. And she's taken a lot of creative writing. So she's very, very critical. So it's a bracing experience when she reads my stuff. And she also produces a lot more than I do. It takes me 3, 4, 5, 6 years to produce a novel. So it's a very occasional experience for her to read my stuff. So she really goes to town, whereas I read her stuff more regularly. And yeah, it's a mutually reinforcing experience. I said, we work in different genres. We have different sensibilities. So it's nice to be with someone who understands what you're trying to do.
I see that you're in your studio with your treadmill desk. Does Alice share this office with you, or she's got her own studio?
She's got her own studio and her own treadmill desk.
Okay, cool. Tell us about the
We both have them. It's a wonderful way of working.
Okay. How does it affect? How does it inform your work? Being on the go, exercising while you're thinking and typing. This is post, I imagine.
Yeah, I've had it for a number of years now. Well, it just means I'm not sitting all day long. So I don't know if I'm so much exercise, because after all, I'm walking at a fairly leisurely pace. 1.2 miles an hour is the right speed for me. So you're just walking at a leisure. It just means you're not sitting. I have the fidgets, otherwise I'm sort of moving around. So if I'm standing and walking, it's a very nice way to do it. And I can type just as well. That's not an issue. I can't use a conventional mouse. I have to use the trackpad. The mouse is a bit too wiggly, so I use a trackpad. I love it. I just finished my latest novel, and I wrote, in fact, the last 2.5 books I've written on the treadmill desk, walking away, walking hundreds of miles. So it's just a nice way to be in your mind while you're writing. At the same time, your body is gently being used too.
Please tell us about the latest book. This is the one based on Iliad, on the Iliad, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I hadn't, I think you end up writing books in some cases just because of the happenstance of life. And one of the happenstances of my life was I had never read the Iliad. I had read about the Trojan War. I think many children do, Roger Llewellyn Green and, what's the other one? Yeah. The other writer who wrote about myths. Anyway, I wrote about the Trojan War, read about it, and but I'd never actually read the original text. And so a few years ago, I finally picked it up. And thankfully, in a very good translation by an American translator named Stephen Mitchell. And I had sort of expected the Iliad to be a slightly dull classic, fusty and a little bit dull and grand in a sort of boring way. Well, not at all. It was an absolutely thrilling read. There's some scenes in there that are just astonishingly cinematic. And of course, it's an extraordinarily violent text, which is also engaging in a way. It can be repelling, but it's very engaging. So I was unexpectedly thrilled by this, basically the very first book in the West. And it just started speaking to me. And so, in a way, quite unreflective, I couldn't let it go. Because one thing that struck me with the Iliad, so this is the foundational text of Western literature, literally the very first book written down in around 700 BCE. And it's all about anger. It's about two men who are angry at each other, Agamemnon and Achilles. And it just struck me how interesting that this foundational book of the West is about anger. And then the other foundational book about the West, the Gospels, is about love. These two basic emotions side by side. Okay, 700 years apart, but at that time that would make no difference. And, these two key emotions of the foundational text, anger and love. So I just thought that was kind of interesting. And as I said, it wouldn't let go of me. So finally, in a sort of zigzaggy way, I came up with this story of a modern day scholar, who discovers a lost Trojan War tradition. Because, of course, the Iliad was told by Homer, who was one of a long lineage of bards who would travel and tell stories. And so there's all kinds of stories being told. The Iliad, of course, is just one small part of the Trojan War. It takes place over 52 days, and it's about this quarrel between two leaders. But the Trojan horse is not in the Iliad. The death of Achilles is not in the Iliad. The first 9 years of the war is not in the Iliad, except for odd references. These are told in other stories that were told by other Trojan War traditions. So anyway, my scholar discovers a lost Trojan War tradition to do with the commoner. In the Iliad, every single person who speaks, with one exception, every single person who speaks is either a king or a prince or a noble of one sort or another. There's only one commoner who speaks, a man named Thersites, who berates Agamemnon and is promptly beaten by Odysseus. So in my story, it's this lost tradition about a commoner. And the scholar discovers this lost tradition. So it's a novel that will be told in the page is divided in two. The top half are these lost fragments from this lost tradition, and the bottom half is footnotes. So a novel told entirely in verse and footnotes. And the footnotes are commentary, of course, on the verse, but they tell their own story too. They tell the story of how the fragments were found. They tell the story of the scholar himself. So I said the closest formal comparison I can think of is a novel called Pale Fire by Vladimir Nabokov, which is also in verse and in footnotes. But so that's it. So it's about this lost Trojan War tradition as to why it disappeared and what exactly this commoner. His name is Soaz. Soaz is this commoner from Medea, Soaz of Medea. And he does something very unusual. And so the fragments are all about that. So I just finished it. I'm just about to start the editorial process in a week or two.
That's fantastic. When do we expect the book to be out? And what's the title?
I'm not sure yet. I haven't decided. I think likely it'll come out in the spring of 22. And the title is Son of Nobody.
Okay. Good. We look forward to it. Jan, can you tell us about your creative process? How do you come upon ideas? How do you commit them to paper? What your editing process is like?
Well, it starts for me with an idea that resonates, that really stays with me. So it can't be just an anecdote, can't be a neat little twist. It has to be something that I can really spend time with. And those arise, well, in this case, as I said, from reading a book, the Iliad. Other times it's from travels. So Life of Pi came to me as a result of traveling to India. It comes from moments of openness. So Life of Pi, again, I was not only in India, but I suddenly happened to notice religious manifestations around me, not just Hinduism, but also Islam. And for the first time in my life, I sort of said, what is this about? Because I grew up in a very strongly secular tradition where art displaced religion, and art was the way to really explore life. If you want to understand life, read great novels, listen to great music, etc. That was the way to explore the human condition, which is indeed a very, very good way to do it. But then in India, I happened to notice people praying in one way or another. And I sort of said, how odd that after centuries of the triumph of science and logic and reason, there should still be people who are religious. What's that about? What's the glue that holds that stuff still together? So that happened to be a moment of openness. And then the rest is just a lot of hard work. So Life of Pi, I did about 2 years of research. I also wrote a novel called Beatrice and Virgil, which is about the Holocaust. And so for that, I read any number of books on the Holocaust. I went to Poland. I visited Auschwitz 3 times. I do a lot of research, which I love doing. It's kind of like being at school. You learn about something in a deep way. And as I'm doing my research, I take notes, voluminous notes. The notes are sometimes quotations. Sometimes I will copy out entire pages of a book. Sometimes it's words, bits of dialogue, scenes and then I end up with 500-600 pages of notes, which I print up, and then I take a pair of scissors and I cut the papers into various component parts. I put in envelopes, and so for example, in this one here, I don't know if you can see well, yeah, there you go. Hades explains the gift, so as looks for it. So when it's in red, this was a fragment on the top of the page, and when something was in blue, like this here, it's the bottom of the page. And if there's a cross, that means I finally didn't use it. So whatever notes were in here were for nothing, and I just didn't use it. Same thing with here, the animal. I was going to have something to do with a specific animal. I didn't use it finally. Whereas ones that have this little round notch, that means I have used it. So these I all then put them in the order in which they'll appear in the novel. And that ends up being the backbone of my novel, the bones of it, the skeletal structure. And that means when I sit down to actually write, because otherwise, how can you write a 500-page novel? You can't just sit down and start writing. Maybe some writers can. I certainly can't. That means when I start writing, I actually pull out the first envelope, open it, and I have these little snippets. And those are the background or the notes that I'll use to write that chapter. So, for example, with Life of Pi, the very first chapter, the very first envelope was just called the author's note. And in there were all the elements that I wanted to mention with the author's note. So that's sort of the starting point of each chapter or part of a chapter. Put them in the order in which they'll appear, the chronological order, and then I just start writing. And when I've gone through the last envelope, when I finish with the last envelope, that is, I got my first draft. And then I get rid of the envelopes, and then I have one large file with my book, and then I just keep on working it. I endlessly rework. I mean, people sometimes ask me, how many drafts do you write? And I suppose, Jane Austen had 2. She wrote it out, then a few little corrections, and there she had perfection. Well, she was great. I'm not. So I do hundreds of drafts. Every time I work, I open up my file, I'll go back and I'll start rereading again. And I will change a sentence. I'll change a word. I'll change punctuation. I constantly do that. Very, very, it's like a painter putting a little touch of color, like a pointillist putting a little dot of color and then taking it away, putting it back, taking it away, changing colors. I do these little dots. And over the course of months and years, I end up finding something that I'm capable of letting go of.
And in terms of writing discipline, is this a daily thing that you do from 9 to 5? Or how does your day proceed?
I do it as much as I can. I have 4 children, 4 young children. They're 11, 9, 7, and 5. So I love them, but they've destroyed my life. As a writer, they take a lot of time. So in the days before I had children, yes, I would do it every day. Because what's wonderful about writing, and it's the same thing with all creative acts, whether it's painting, dancing, composing, is you are creating life where before there was nothing. It is you have this ancestral soup with nothing, and you start creating amoebas, and these amoebas very quickly evolve into life forms, viable life forms. So it's extraordinarily satisfying. And of course, you have to like your medium. And I love just being with the words that I'm composing. I love tinkering with them. I love getting it right. Now, of course, this is all internal. You can very well spend years working on something that then critics say is a terrible, terrible book. But that's you. When you write, when you create art, you have to ignore the world. You have to sort of turn your back on the world, and it's a very discreet, private process. And I love doing that. I love just playing with what I'm trying to do. And every day I have, is this working? How do I make it work better? Would this adjective work? Is this too much? Maybe I should do more. Does this make sense? What am I trying to say here? That incessant dialogue is one I never tire of. So yeah, I do it every day. I definitely work. I mean, the children go off to school around 8:30. I have email, of course, to deal with, stuff like that. But then I'll spend all day at it. It's not an intense process. I'm certainly not writing, 1,000 words a day. Some days, when I'm in the middle of these envelopes and I pull out a section that is complete, then it's a question of retyping it. And so, yes, I've allegedly written a certain number of words, but other days I'll have written barely anything because I'm just tinkering. But that process I'm quite happy doing for a very long time. And of course, a computer helps. It's much easier writing on a computer. My first novel, I hand wrote, thinking that if I wrote it by hand, it's so slow, I would write better. But when it finally came time to typing that up, I made so many changes. I realized it was a complete waste of time. I should have right away typed it directly. So I love my computer. My word processing is a very powerful way to bring words together. So yeah, I can do that every day, all day.
Excellent. You've said that fatherhood is an experience similar to religious ecstasy. Can you elaborate on that? How has fatherhood changed you as an artist?
Fatherhood. Well, it's funny when Alice became pregnant the first time, my first thought was my life is over. Because I used to love exploring the outer world. My parents being diplomats, I traveled with them in a coddled way. And then as a grown-up, I just kept on traveling. I backpacked through, a good number of South America, through Europe, through India. I love traveling. To me, the world is like a book, and as you travel, you are reading. And every new day in a new country is a page turned. And so that was one way I understood and explored life, was by traveling around the world. A very common experience for many people. That. So when I had a child, I realized, I couldn't travel that much. I said, oh my God, that's one of my ways of apprehending life is coming to a close. I can't be the sort of father who just disappears for months on end. That would not be fair to Alice or to my child. But then I discovered that, in fact, as a father, you start exploring an inner world, the inner world of your child's development. One of the amazing things I found with my children is the acquisition of language. You have this little thing that suddenly one day starts speaking. And it's the degree to which they start speaking in complete sentences, their intuitive leap in understanding languages, that I just found astonishing. And seeing their little minds expand and apprehend the world, that expansion and all that is sort of an inner world that has been a joy to discover. And I still miss seeing the outer world. But it's been very interesting seeing these little people and also raising them. I love reading to my children. I read to them every day. They're always getting me and I wrong. Me and Jasper did this. No, Jasper and I did this. You wouldn't say me did this. You'd say I did this. I'm constantly correcting them so they speak well. But yeah, it's a lovely, lovely thing, and it is, it does bring a kind of sometimes maddening kind of ecstasy to be the father of these four children.
You've also said that the story with God is the better story. How much of your personal story benefits from God? And what has your most quote-unquote religious experience been?
Yeah, when I said that, I have to be careful because, as we've seen recently with democracy in the United States, any good thing can be kidnapped. So religion, of course, can be kidnapped by extremists, as can democracy, as can anything. So when I speak of religion in Life of Pi, in no way am I countenancing religious fundamentalists or extremists of any stripe. So it's a sort of idealized form of religion that I'm speaking of, and that's fair game. I mean, it's no point talking of a system of thinking and immediately seeking its flaws. You have to start with the principles that are positive and see what those are like. So, just because of what happens, for example, happening in the U.S. recently with Donald Trump and the January 6th, the attack on the Capitol, that's not democracy at its best. That's democracy at its worst. If you want to talk about democracy, you have to look at the American Constitution and other feats of democracy across the world. Same thing with religion. Of course, you can find things that are terrible about religion: extremism, violence, patriarchy, sexism, homophobia, anti-Semitism, etc. That's not what I was interested in. I was interested in, what is why do some people still go towards religion? Of course, some it's convention, some they have no choice, frankly. But what's the positive aspect of it? Because surely, like slavery, if religion were all terrible, it would have been abandoned like slavery was in most countries, quite a while ago. So I discovered religion while traveling through India, in part because they were mostly foreign religions. Of course, there's Christianity in India, which Christianity is as alien to me as any other, but I'm still vaguely familiar with Christianity because I grew up in a Western society that traditionally was Christian. But in India, I encountered, Hinduism, Islam, Jainism, Buddhism, all of which were on the outside to me. And Islam and Hinduism are particularly social forms of religion. You have massive festivals and pilgrimages in India where hundreds of thousands of Hindus participate. Islam, mosques are very open spaces. People pray in their hundreds. I started observing that, and I suddenly switched around saying, okay, I don't like what the bad things people do with religion, but when they do it well, I suddenly realized that in many ways it's very similar to art. What you do with art, what an artist does with art, is he or she takes an ordinary reality and gilds it, orders it, gives it meaning. That's what a novel does. It takes disparate experiences of life and orders them in a way that is suddenly meaningful. And that's exactly what religion does. It takes ordinary experiences and say, no, there's an order here. There's a meaning to this. And both imply an act of faith. The traditional saying about a novel is that it suspends your disbelief. Mm-hmm. You start reading it and you start believing it, and because you believe it, it has an effect on you, regardless of what you're reading, Agatha Christie or a great novel. You're supposed to suspend your disbelief. Well, religion is the same thing. It's just called faith. When you have faith in a religion, whatever religion, you suspend your disbelief, and that's the key first step. So I just noticed a commonality that in both cases, art and religion gild life with a kind of meaning that it doesn't otherwise have. And just as there are bad novels, there's bad religions, there's bad religious practices, there's bad, rightly practices. But when it works well, it's transformative. So to answer your question, my greatest religious experience is simply to see that you have to open yourself up to other systems of belief. What I've come to realize, because don't forget, I'm a Westerner from a secular tradition and I studied philosophy. I finally realized that every system is self-reinforcing. So I was too reasonable. And thank God I got to India when this happened, because I realized I was becoming trapped by reason. My questions were reasonable, and because my questions were reasonable, I could only accept reasonable answers. And that finally meant that my imagination was drawing away, which is not a good thing when you're a writer, when you're an artist. And it was when I traveled to India and saw all these wildly imaginative things that religious Indians were doing, that I said, well, maybe there's other ways of apprehending existence. And that simple thought there made me realize, okay, there's other ways of apprehending life. I should open myself to them and put reason in its place. So the whole point of Life of Pi was to point out that reason is just a tool. It's a very useful tool. It's a very powerful tool, but it is just a tool. And it has to be put to good use. And the only thing that can make it be put to good use is having some sort of faith in something, whether a god or a sports team or a loved one, a cause, whatever. So to answer your question, the greatest religious experience for me would simply be to realize that there's something greater out there. And I don't know what it is, but I should open myself to it and stop just being this tightly wound little computer and letting go. That's the greatest religious act, is letting go.
I mean, whether it's a boy stuck on a boat with a tiger or a man walking backwards in the high mountains of Portugal, you make the bizarre very believable, as somebody put it, and that sort of transfixes and has transfixed readers. Before Beatrice and Virgil, and before the high mountains of Portugal, you mailed 100 books to the Prime Minister of Canada because you wanted him to open his mind. Are you a political person? Was this a political act?
Yes, I'm a citizen. I mean, as we found out recently in the U.S., to be a citizen is arduous. Democracy doesn't just happen. Just as, frankly, religion doesn't just happen. You have to implicate yourself. You have to involve yourself. So yes, I'm a conscientious citizen. We live in a planet that's burning away because of climate change. I live in Canada, where there's still a high degree of sexism. There's far less homophobia now. Gay marriage is legal in Canada. But all these things are acquired through standing up for our rights. So with Stephen Harper, the Prime Minister in question a few years ago, it came out that he never read anymore. He read as a young man, but it's quite clear that he stopped reading seriously as an adult. So one of these things that we found out was that during one of the elections, each leader of a party was asked what his or her favorite book was. Well, his favorite book, there are no female leaders. What his favorite book was. And Stephen Harper's reply, if you can believe it, is a book called the Guinness Book of World Records, which, I would understand if I were a 14 or 15-year-old boy. But coming from the mouth of a 45-year-old man, I was thinking, wow, the Guinness Book of World Records is your favorite book? So he's one of these, from the West, typical middle-aged white man who doesn't read. He'll maybe read the odd, biography. He'll read his newspapers, but he will not read complete books anymore. And I'm thinking, I wouldn't care, except he's Prime Minister. He has power over me. And if he has power over me, I want to find out who he is. And one important aspect of someone is their imagination, where they get their dreams. Because after all, it's from our dreams that we act. So I was concerned that this man never read. So yes, as a political act, every 2 weeks, I sent him a book. And very wide-ranging. It was fiction, novels, poetry, plays. I sent him the Bhagavad Gita, a variety of texts from around the world, not just Canada, not just originally in English, all genres too. I sent him an Agatha Christie. I sent him a Harlequin romance, which is a formulaic romance here in Canada, and also high literature, everything. Just say, this is what the written word can do. Read this and you'll be slightly changed. Books are transformative.
Did Mr. Harper respond to you in any way, or what was the public reaction to this act?
He never replied. His correspondence staff replied. In total, for 101 books, we got 7 letters at random intervals, but never from him. Always from some 20-something-year-old in the correspondence staff who write to everyone who writes to them. In Canada, if you write to the Prime Minister, you will get a reply. It won't be from him, from the Prime Minister. It'll be from someone in the name of the Prime Minister. Thank you for writing. The Prime Minister, appreciates your letter. Thank you very much. 3 lines. I got 7 of those, but none from the man himself. And considering I sent him a book, and each book came with a letter explaining something about the book, or it was a starting point. And so finally, those letters were collected in a book. What is Stephen Harper reading? And no, I never got a reply from him, which is an astonishing astonishing failure to dialogue with someone. I mean, why wouldn't I? It's not a question of shaming him, but saying, surely you've got to read something. How do you nourish your imagination? Otherwise, you're just going on the same ideas you've had for 25 years. You've got to renew yourself. So no, he never replied. So after 4 years, when I got to the number 100, I gave up. And all the books I also sent him were always relatively short, like they were 200 pages or less. Because the fact is, if you're going to read an 800-page experimental novel is a real commitment. Of course, he's busy. We're all busy. So I sent him, usually they were 200 pages or less. So, for example, the very first one I sent him was The Death of Ivan Ilyich, speaking of the Russians, by Leo Tolstoy, which is an astonishing novella. So powerful, light, funny, but very deeply serious. So I sent him 100 books like that. No, he never replied.
And just going back to The Life of Pi, that was a book that changed your life overnight. You went from a struggling writer, an impoverished writer who was doing odd jobs as a car wash person, a security guard, to becoming a household literary name. The follow-up novel was, while it was on the New York Times bestsellers list, it received a lot of critical flack. How personally did you take the reviews, especially coming off the heels of Life of Pi, which was just universally praised? It's a really good text.
I suppose some writers, first of all, at one point I stopped reading reviews because either way, even the positive reviews sometimes don't please you, because maybe people praise it for the wrong reason. Just as sometimes bad reviews don't bother you because they're damning it for the wrong reason. So what was interesting, see, the point of Beatrice and Virgil, which did receive some absolutely terrible reviews in the United States, is I was just pointing out there was this horrific event that happened between 1939 and 1945 in Central and Eastern Europe, in which a completely innocent population were slaughtered, up to just about 6 million people, men, women, and children. It came to be called the Holocaust. It's practically branded, trademarked as a word. And it's a terrible, horrible event, and quite not entirely unique, but to the degree to which it was done, yes, absolutely unique. Of course, there's been genocides before, but never quite to the extent of the Holocaust, where the Jews were viewed as a plague, as a disease. Whereas, the Armenians in Turkey, for example, it was only the Armenians who were in central Turkey who were massacred. The Armenians outside of the Ottoman Empire were not killed. So it wasn't quite as hygienic an approach as the Germans took. So my point with Beach and Virgil was to point out that this event that is monumental, horrific, we're always talking about it in the same way. Most every book on the Holocaust takes a historical approach. In other words, any novel will take place between 39 and 45 in Central and Eastern Europe, featuring Jews and non-Jews. It's the same approach time and time again. And there's nothing wrong with that. So there's been some extraordinarily powerful works of nonfiction, history books, and indeed thinly veiled biographies and autobiographies, but they all strike the same note. And my point was simply, at one point, this will get boring. We're going to sort of feel that we've been there and done that before. And we don't have that same approach with war. War lends itself wonderfully to metaphoric interpretation. A lot of science fiction movies take on wars. You can deal with war with poetry. And also, people I've noticed are much less nervous about war. You'll have people talk about any war without any particular nervousness. Even though they're not veterans, they'll just talk about war. We'll talk about the First World War, the Second World War. People talk about war very comfortably. It's interesting how with the Holocaust, people very quickly get nervous, especially if they're not Jewish. If they're not Jewish, they get nervous. So I just sort of point out, listen, we're limiting the way we talk about the Holocaust here. Is that good? Are we really getting as much we can out of it if we're so nervous talking about the Holocaust? So the whole point of Beatrice and Virgil was to try to discuss this monumental event. And listen, I'm not Jewish. I'm not of German descent. It's a completely external event to me. But I said, this strikes me as being such an important event for world history, not just for Jews in Europe or Poles in Europe, for everyone. Surely we need to approach it in a way that speaks to everyone. And the best way to do that is through art. The novel is a fantastic way to take on a reality and make it comprehensible and felt. And a perfect example of that I give is Animal Farm. Animal Farm by George Orwell, which is this delightful little novel about this farm in England where the animals take over and set up this perfect system. It's obviously an allegory and a a critique of Stalinism, of communism in Russia. But it's done in a light way, but it tells you this is what happened in Russia. You don't have to read 500 books of history to understand it. Just read this novel, you'll understand the mechanism, disinformation, fear, propaganda. It's an extraordinary book, and it's done through barely 100 pages. That is powerful. And we don't do that with the Holocaust. So in Beatrice and Virgil, I was trying to do that. Whether I succeeded or not is beside the point. And it was interesting to which a number of people reacted very strongly against saying, we don't want to do this. And I'm saying, well, then you're basically condemning the Holocaust to being painted always with the same color. And eventually people are going to get bored with that color. And therefore there's the fear we're not going to fully learn what we can from it. And this sort of approach, I think, approach to everything. Obviously, you don't necessarily want to have an alternate Holocaust take with the Holocaust survivor. Someone who's actually been through the Holocaust doesn't need metaphor. They've been there. Same thing with any other kind of tragedy. Rape. A woman who's been raped doesn't care to hear rape being used as a metaphor for the destruction of the environment. Cutting down a tree is not the same thing as a woman being raped. But rape is a good metaphor for people who have not been raped to make them understand destruction of some form. We have to properly use metaphor because it's an extraordinarily powerful tool. That's what I was trying to do in Beatrice and Virgil. And indeed, it had sometimes some very bad reviews from people who were not interested in that approach. I think to their loss. How did I feel about it? It strikes me, if you've read the book, you are entitled to feel whatever you feel about it. So I don't write my books to be liked. I write books, hopefully, so people read them and start thinking and get into a dialogue. If at the end of the dialogue you disagree, that's totally fine. So Beatrice and Virgil, I still am fascinated by the topic. So I didn't particularly, I let it go and moved on and wrote High Mountains of Portugal, and that one did well enough, and we'll see how this one, the next one, the Son of Nobody, the Trojan War one, I'm really excited about because it's a very interesting format I've taken, and I do very clever things, I think. So I'm curious to see. But art is about letting go. I said that earlier about religion. Art is a gift. You create something, you give it to the world, and then you have to let go. It's not a question of ends. It's a question of just creating something, and the world can do what it wants with it.
Yann, what were the 5 books you would recommend for readers in Pakistan?
Well, taking every Pakistani citizen as a Prime Minister of Canada, as I said, the list there that I gave out 100 books. The ones that, I said the first one that I sent Prime Minister Harper was the Death of Ivan Illich, which is all about how we approach our death, which is useful for any citizen, anyone, any human being. At one point, we'll have to cross that threshold. It's an extraordinarily engaging way of discussing how someone comes up to their death. So that would be one that any citizen could read. Oddly enough, when people ask me about the books that I sent Prime Minister Harper, the one that I often bring up is this Harlequin romance. So Harlequin romance, to Pakistani readers, Harlequin is a company that produces these very formulaic romances. And they've really micro-calibrated them. So you can have gauzy little romance where there's barely any kissing. Then you can have, ones that are much more sexual. You have the whole gamut of them to address. So they're completely formulaic. And I thought, I bought mine at a supermarket. It wasn't even in a bookstore. It was in a supermarket I bought it. And I thought initially I'd hate it. And what was funny is that in some ways it was very memorable because the appeal of formulaic fiction is that it caters to you. It wants to please you. So in a romance, the point is to basically say love will triumph. Love will make the world better. If you're a woman, you will meet a handsome man who will sweep you away. If you're a man, you will meet this wonderful woman whom you will love. And it makes for a nice, pleasing end. It's a very optimistic gesture, full of beautiful men and beautiful women who have great sex or great kisses at the very least. And so it's very pleasing in a sense. So that one, it's good to sometimes be deluded that everything is possible. So read something like that. One of the books I also sent Prime Minister Harper, and I discussed it in the High Mountains of Portugal, is Agatha Christie. Agatha Christie stands out as a writer in the world because she is the most best-selling author of all time in any language, any culture, anywhere. She has sold, her books have sold literally, I can't remember, I think it was 3 billion. It's astonishing, her reach. It's astonishing. And I was wondering, this is a woman, first of all, a very shy, retiring woman writing genre fiction. How did she get to be popular? And it's because, once again, it's murder mystery is always inherent. There's a murder, there's death, and it's understanding the context of that death, which I think fascinates everyone. Because we know we're mortal, we're interested in what limits our mortality. And we're scared of death because it is a terrible thing, but we know we have to think about it. All of us have had little accidents or maybe big accidents. We all know that this is not going to last forever. And so, but we don't like to approach it directly, because to directly look at death, to go to a hospital and see someone dying is a really depressing experience, and we don't want to do that. What murder mysteries do is they bring you close to death, but in a way that's very entertaining. And it's a very moral thing, a murder mystery. In a murder mystery, you normally always find out who did it. You must account for someone's death. Even if the dead person is a terrible person. For example, in Murder on the Orient Express, the victim is a terrible American gangster. Nonetheless, you need to find out who did it and why. There needs to be some accounting. And that is that's very moral, first of all. And it's also something we all need. We want to find some sort of reason for why we die. So I think that's why Agatha Christie is so popular, because in a sort of non-religious way, she does what religion does. She talks about death and its meaning. So I recommend reading an Agatha Christie. And other than that, God, you've just asked me, I haven't thought of it, but obviously a great book. You know, since I was talking to you in Lahore, I just remembered years ago, I read Twilight in Delhi. I forget the author's name. It's an English Pakistani novel called Twilight in Delhi. And it's about a man who raises pigeons, I remember. That one thing struck me. You know, you have to read your own literature, of course. So I just, you know, you can read that, Twilight in Delhi. What was the name? Oh, I should have checked out the name. I just forgotten that. Other than that, I just read a book called nonfiction called Invisible Women by a woman named Caroline Criado Perez, which is about the way we've set up the world. We basically forget half the population. And so it's about the gender data gaps. In other words, how people, when they do experiments and design a product, the default sex is male. Everything's, you know, the size of seat belts, the way shelves are made in supermarkets, the weight and size of cell phones, they're all designed for the typical man. Typical man has a larger hand than a woman. So cell phones are too big for women. Seat belts often are too high for women. Crash test dummies are always crash test dummies of males, not females. So it's a fascinating look at how we've measured the world to the measure of man, but we've mismeasured women. So it's a really interesting book about that called, I said, Invisible Women.
And the Twilight in Delhi book is an author by the name of Ahmed Ali.
Ali, that's it. That's right. Okay. Ahmed Ali, right.
I'm just going to put this on pause and get Ms. Shamsie back.
I wanted to say how very interesting that was. I loved so many things that you talked about. Most recently, because Ahmed Ali's novel is one that I love. I love Agatha Christie also. It's wonderful that you should recommend them. I love the concept of people as home, of work, of your writing as home. I'm absolutely fascinated by the Iliad, largely because my dad used to read it in Greek, which I never could, but he was always banging on about it. And then I read it, or I heard it being read. It was recited from the Royal Theatre recently. I heard it being read in English, and I was spellbound, just as you were. And so there are lots and lots of things that you said that I really enjoyed. And I think we come to a close. I would like to thank everybody for tuning in and listening. I'd like to thank you, Yann and Fasih, for making this such an interesting session. And for everyone else, please tune in. Look at the LLF program. You'll follow it on the Facebook page. And I hope you will tune in to lots more. And thank you again, Yann and Fasih.
We're very excited about Son of Nobody, and hopefully next year we'll be able to launch it in Lahore at the Lahore Literary Festival. Yann, it's been an
absolute that'd be wonderful. Yes, that really would be. Yes.
Good. I'd love to come. Thank you very much, Fasih. Thank you, Muniza. It was a pleasure.